I'm starting the recording now, I hope. And I hope you can see the slides for the lecture. So today the subject is what I call socioeconomic spaces, and it is quite conceptual in nature. And so it requires your attention. And so what I will do is try to break it up again into today's meeting into 4 pieces. And hopefully I hope to finish well in advance of 5 o'clock. But the last week I also said that, and then it was quite close to 5 actually, before we finally were done. There's simply quite a lot to talk about. So it's not that easy. So today's topic is really a conceptual idea of an economy. So when we have to go to a theory of an economy, what is an economy and what is happening within the economy, it's good to have a framework. And so that framework is then what I call the socioeconomic space. But it is a conceptual framework. And then we are filling in the blanks by using mathematical tools, the ones that you probably know, like utility functions, production functions, and the like. And then so we fill this framework with mathematical notions. And then these mathematical notions we can use to model what happens in the economy. And in particular, we will see what prices there emerge in that economy. And we can then understand the consequences of all these trade activities, whether there will be inequality or equality within this framework. So this is the first step to a mathematical model, a mathematical theory, essentially. The mathematical theory is called economy usually. So when I say, let's set up an economy, the word economy refers to a mathematical model of a construction of an abstraction of a real life economy. Socioeconomic space is a conceptual construction in a similar way that an economy is a mathematical construction. And they're closely related. But socioeconomic space is more general because an economy, that is mathematical. Therefore, everything that is in an economy has to be translated to mathematics. However, in a socioeconomic space, that is not necessarily the case. You can talk about institutions, for example. Institutions are much more difficult, much more fuzzy than mathematics allows. So the mathematics is something that really is restricting us in that regard. However, the mathematics give you a very precise tool. It gives you very precise answers. It gives you numerical answers even in some cases. Socioeconomic space can never do that. It always remains concepts. It always remains fuzzy. It always remains debatable. However, for certain things, it's a great tool. If you want to talk about Brexit, that is the tool to use. And it is much harder to talk about Brexit when it comes to the mathematics. For example, in all the debate about Brexit over the past 5 years, essentially, numerous times economists have tried to predict what would happen with regard to Brexit and how bad it would be for the economy. Because, yeah, when you break international trade relations, there will be a hit to the economy. So that was not debated, but how large would that be then? And the answer was very difficult to give because the mathematics is too precise in some sense. It does not allow this fuzziness, and it gave completely wrong predictions in some sense. Nobody forecasted that there will be a 68% drop in the first month after Brexit in the trade between the EU and the UK. And that was reported just this past week in the media, that there was this 68% drop. So mathematics restricts you quite a bit. However, it is great to give very precise answers and to give you a hands-on feeling for what is happening. The socioeconomic space is much more fuzzy, much more conceptual. It gives you a great tool to debate, to philosophize, to discourse. And the combination of the two, in some sense, give you the best perspective on things. So for certain incarnations of very precise institutions like a market mechanism or a trade network mechanism, you can give very precise answers using mathematics. However, for a debate about institutions, about the fuzziness of the institutions and all that, it's much better to use the socioeconomic space. So that is the preamble to today's presentation in some sense. Yeah. So that is what I want to take you away from today. You know, it's a conceptual tool to help you talk about things. So socioeconomic space is a conceptual representation, mainly theoretical in the sense of conceptual, of all aspects that are directly related to that functioning of the social division of labor. And it is mainly built around those institutions that we talked about. It's a very institutional conception. And of course, it embeds this trade infrastructure that emerges from the social division of labor. Yeah. So those are very important main aspects. So the socioeconomic space captures the architecture of the economy, as I call that. That's a very important ingredient to the socioeconomic space. Yeah. So let's put it in a diagram. So the next slides, I will develop a diagram. So let's first talk about what are the basic ingredients that we are talking about here with regard to the socioeconomic space. And there are three of them. Those are the economic agents that we talked about. Everything is done by humans, and we incarnate them in our theory as economic agents. They're caricatures, of course, abstractions of real human beings and their decisions, but we focus on their economic decisions. Then those decisions lead to economic interaction, of course, and those are guided then by those institutions, as I already set out in the previous lectures. And those things together, those three together, those are the basic ingredients of an economic system. And that is what I call the socioeconomic space. So the socioeconomic space consists of three ingredients in some sense. And we can then dig deeper into these ingredients. Now, this is complemented by two other aspects, two other principles, and that is embeddedness and entrepreneurship. We already talked about embeddedness. This referred to that everybody is completely embedded, as we call it, in fictional narratives. We accept certain constructs that we as humans put together, and that guides us in our behavior. And that embeddedness is founded on a blind trust of the institutions. So we will not question our language. As soon as you start to question your language, for example, the English language, then you become inept. You become very, it becomes a big problem. You cannot express yourself anymore because you're thinking about what words to use, etc. Yeah. That struggling with, or the desire to change, that is captured by entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship is this element of change of socioeconomic institutions. We talked about, for example, the deepening of the social division of labor. That ties in with entrepreneurship. Somebody starts off a debate about commodities. We should have another commodity because that would better our wealth, that would increase our wealth, and we should pursue that. That is an entrepreneur. That is somebody who changes things. Yeah. So this then leads us to a possibility to put it into a diagram. So there are three fundamental layers in that diagram. The governing institutions, that's the founding force. That is where everything is embedded. It's the ground, so to say. And then the trade infrastructure that essentially builds on that. And then, of course, the economic agents who are essentially bearing all these activities that are captured in that trade infrastructure. Those are the three layers. And then we have these forces. Embeddedness, the agents' use of the institutions, how we use them, how we build our interactions. For example, firms are interactions. So how do we set up a firm? What are the rules that we use? What is the legal foundation for a firm? What laws are we using? All these elements are in this embeddedness. And then our desire to change that. And so entrepreneurship comes to the fore as what I call, or what I prefer to call, the entrepreneurial function, because it takes it away from the entrepreneur, right? An entrepreneur is just an individual. It's Bezos, it is Bill Gates, it's Steve Jobs. Those guys are entrepreneurs. But it goes much deeper than that. There is a deep underlying process of complex change going on all the time in our economy. And I call that the entrepreneurial function. And this relates directly to those institutions, how we want to change them, how we want to adapt them in order to meet our needs. And those needs are based on that embeddedness in some sense. The embeddedness is not functioning optimally. And as a consequence, we want to change things. And that is that entrepreneurial function. I will talk in the second half today extensively about entrepreneurship and the different forms of the entrepreneurial function in some sense. And we will see that it is not really about these very exceptional guys that we know as entrepreneurs. It goes much deeper and it is much more broad than that. There is a lot of elements to the entrepreneurial function in our economy. Yeah, let's put that in a picture. So I have those three layers. The first layer is that of the economic agents. Then I introduced the ground layer, those are the institutions. And then in between those, there are the interactions. That is the trade infrastructure. So the trade infrastructure is in some sense an interplay, an in-between thing between those very fundamental things, namely the bearers of everything, the economic agents, and those fictional narratives that we have created, but that live by themselves because those fictional narratives are no longer individualized. They go beyond us. This is our social toolbox, and it lives beyond the economic agents, and we can use those to interact with each other. We use our language, we use our norms, our culture, our tools like money to interact with each other. And those money is not individually determined, contrary to your individual preferences, contrary to your individual productive abilities. Those stand in contrast to these collective elements, these institutional elements. Now, where do those two meet? those meet in the trade infrastructure. That is where we interact with each other. Now note also, which is very, very strange to say, the only thing that we can measure in the economy is what is captured in the trade infrastructure. That is what we can measure. We cannot measure the productive abilities of an economic agent. It has to be expressed in order to be measurable. So there's an innate ability in an economic agent to be productive or to consume, but it has to be expressed in something, otherwise it's no longer measurable. And that measurement is called demand, for example, or supply, or work hours, or he produced so many units of output. He made so many paper clips from a metal wire during his workday. Those things can be measured. And that is what we measure. This is what econometrics is about. Econometrics concentrates on that trade infrastructure in some sense. Also the institutions, language, culture, those are not measurable by themselves. They need to be expressed into something. An artwork has to be created and submitted to as an element of supply in the art market, for example, to be measurable. Yeah, so those are very important ingredients um, to be aware of in some sense. Yeah. Are there any questions about this measurability issue? All right, then how do we represent then these two principles? In some sense, you can think of these two principles as a kind of forces that are at play in this kind of sandwich, in these three layers. Embeddedness pulls everything together, right? It is like gravity. Embeddedness allows the trade infrastructure to form and us to interact with each other. And the coin, the other side of the coin is then trust. Trust makes everything work. Trust gives us the foundation for indeed having successful interaction and successful economic wealth creation. Yeah. So embeddedness is like gravity. Now, the opposite force is this entrepreneurial function, this desire to change. We want to pull, in some sense, the institutions. We want to shake them up. We want to change them because they're not functional. And this is an eternal battle for change. And what we see around us, when we look at the world around us at the moment, there is a lot of desire to change things. This entrepreneurial function is really very active at the moment. And lots of people want change. And there's a lot of unrest in our global economy at the moment. And this has been building very much since 2008. People are not happy with regard to how everything is functioning. And then we're not even talking about all these major problems like the environmental crisis that we currently have. This requires change even. And this entrepreneurial function, how well is that functioning? How well is that doing, this process of change? I will come back to it later. But so those are the two forces in this kind of sandwich model. Yeah. So this diagram should give you a pretty good idea of what I mean with a socio-economic space. It's a conceptual framework to think, to debate, to have a discourse about certain aspects. Yeah. Any questions about this? All right. Let's go a little bit deeper on the various aspects of this socioeconomic space concept. For me, economic agents are always the bearers of everything. Namely, they consume. That means they have individual consumptive preferences. They produce, so they have productive abilities. And how that exactly is translated, that's a different story. And how exactly also we give shape to what consumptive preferences are. Because we also know that there are social preferences. We know that society very, very largely determines what we believe and what we want, right? And what society requires from us even. So there's an enormous component here that is beyond the individual, which is institutional in some sense. Yeah? So, for example, to be a proper member of our current global economy, you really need a smartphone. You really cannot be without a smartphone. And the smartphone is not just that you're consumptive, right? Because you buy a smartphone and you get a subscription to various services, and you get phone service on it, etc. But it also makes you productive. It becomes integral to your productivity, right? And so all these things hang together. It is in some sense very, very connected and very fuzzy. You cannot really separate it. Now, when I would apply mathematics to this, which I will do, I have to strictly delineate those things. I will give these economic agents a consumptive preference represented by some utility function, and productive abilities represented by a production function or a production set. But in real life, those things are connected. There's a fuzziness between them. Yeah, mathematics does not allow me to make it fuzzy. Yeah, and then I'm not even talking about the social abilities to build networks, to trade. Yeah, so this isn't all these aspects come together in an economic agent. Yeah. So when those economic agents then interact with each other, what do we get? We get economic interactions. And what are the various forms of interactions that we know? I will give names to them. That doesn't mean that this is exhaustive. These are the obvious ones. Simple economic interactions are where individuals really emerge as individuals. These are interactions that are driven by individual values, and they lead also to individual use values. Yeah, as part of maybe the big pie of use values that is created in the economy. But simple interactions are the ones that we engage in and we put at the center of economics, like trade. Trade, buying and selling, directly translates into individual values, right? A certain economic agent obtains a certain good in exchange for another good, right? That good might be money, by the way. So that trade goes back to individual values. This stands in contrast to what we can call a collective economic interaction, where it is a collective value, something that we create together, and creation of a collective value, of course, also translates maybe in individual values, because you as an individual participating in a collective economic interaction will take away individual values as well, of course. But it is the main objective of the collective interaction is to create something together, and that where all the participants really have a contribution, and that contribution is not necessarily separable from everybody else's contribution. So in a firm, for example, it's very hard to say person X produced that and that and that in comparison to person Y. It's very hard to say. It might not even be possible because they are doing things together, and actions of X might affect the situation of Y with regard to this collective value that we are producing together, this profit, for example, of this firm. Yeah, a social gathering, having a meal together, right? Having a meal together is an economic interaction also, because use value is generated, and that you cannot necessarily separate the collective value there that is created in the form of that use value, the happiness and the quality of the food and the conversation at the table, etc. All these elements are very important, and they might be non-separable. They cannot be attributed to one individual or the other. Yeah. In regard to these activities, I also want to point out externalities. You know, we talk about a very complex situations here. Externalities refers to effects of those activities on third parties. And we know, of course, externalities are always attached to commodities in economics. This is not the proper way to understand it. It should be attached to economic interactions, because economic commodities are just bearers of certain economic interactions. So when I trade a certain commodity and there are externalities to this transaction, yes, there's a good involved, and maybe the property of the good affects third parties, right? So for example, cigarettes is a traditional example of that, right? If you trade cigarettes and somebody smokes them, and so deduces the use value from them, in other words, it leads to an externality, namely smoking might affect other parties that are not a member of this economic interaction, that were not involved with economic interaction, and because they take secondhand smoke, so to say, that is involved with this. Okay, what about services? Economic goods, I already mentioned now. It's closely related to what we also call services. And I want to redefine services a little bit. I believe that goods and services both are expressions of these interactions, these activities, right? So I have a very network-based understanding of these activities, right? The network itself gives shape to what the good is that is traded there. Yeah? And services is the most direct expression of that, right? It is an even more direct expression than an economic good, for example. A good is a physical bearer, but a service is an immaterial, a non-physical bearer, possibly. Yeah. So I introduce services as another word for simple economic activities. So when individual values are achieved, then I call that economic activity a service. When I trade a commodity with some other individual, that is a service. The act of trading is the service. What is traded, the commodity, that is separated from the service. Yeah. And services are therefore taking a center stage of any economic interaction, and it is the most direct expression of economic interaction in some sense, and it relates to this use value. Yeah, that is what I want to emphasize. So either a service is indirectly leading to use value, or it is directly leading to use value. trade is a great example of a service. Trade is either of an intermediary good, which is indirectly then leading to use value down the road, so to say, or it is directly leading to use value when a consumable is traded. Yeah. Yeah. A service stands in contrast to a collective economic interaction. And for those, I want to use also an alternative word, and we can call them socioeconomic organizations. So a firm is a socioeconomic organization. Yeah? A partnership is a socioeconomic organization, etc. So let me go to the core of the economic activities. Where do they have to lead? They have to lead to that use value. They have to lead to that economic wealth that I talked about. So use value is either directly or indirectly created through those economic activities. Yeah. And we can call economic activities also consumptive, and it directly leads to use values. Yeah. But it can also lead to indirectly to use values, and then we call them productive. Yeah. So we have consumptive services and we have productive services. We have socioeconomic organizations that lead to direct creation of use value that is in some sense a consumptive socioeconomic organization. That is, for example, sharing a meal. But there are also productive socioeconomic organizations. Those are firms, for example, that produce commodities that are traded. And then the act of trading, that's the service that leads then to the use value. It is not the socioeconomic organization that leads to the use value. So I want to delineate these things and introduce various terms to express the same idea, essentially. Yeah. So simple economic interactions, those are services. Those could be consumptive, those could be productive, depending on whether there's what is the relationship to use values. And socioeconomic organizations are referring to collective economic activities that can also be consumptive or productive. Yeah. Is it clear? Are there any questions? Right. A little bit more about services in this context. If you're sharing a family meal, this is a collective form. But you would say, but the main takeaway from the sharing of the meal is still this individualized use value in some sense. Yeah. A singer performing a concert, you buy a ticket, then you write a contract essentially with the singer or the organization that represents the singer. Yeah. And that should lead to individual use value. It is consumptive in nature. A hairstylist cutting a client's hair, it's essentially a transaction, a trade. However, it is not involving a physical commodity, it's involving an immaterial commodity, namely the expenditure of labor, namely the hairstylist's labor, and there's a compensation for that through a contract. And the result is a certain haircut, let's say that, and this is direct use value. It is a consumptive transaction in some sense. Yeah. A grocer selling an apple is also a service, and that apple leads to direct use value. It's a consumptive activity, again, the consumptive services. All of these forms at the foundation are gains from trade, right? This idea that two individuals, two economic agents get together, either in the form of a socioeconomic organization or as an individual. For example, this example of the concert, the provider of the concert is a socioeconomic organization. It's a collective. interacting with an individual procurer of a ticket, so to say, there are gains from trade, yeah, and mutual gains from trade. And this has to do then with this consumptive smoothing that we talked about earlier. Now, productive activities, those are not services in nature. For example, production processes in a factory, those involve a lot of people. It's usually a collective activity. And it leads ultimately to a certain output of the factory that has to be traded, and that then indirectly leads to a profit and a purchasing power to the participants in this production process that then can take it to the market and consume commodities there. However, also bureaucratic activity in an office, like we have at the university, is very much a productive activity. It's much more indirect, right? Bureaucracy is an intermediary good at best. It can also be an intermediary bad, as we call that, a negative good, so to say. But it is always indirect. It is you never procure bureaucratic activity or a bureaucratic service, as we would call that in daily life, to get use value, so to say, right? That is not the case. It is always something that leads indirectly to use value. Educational services, what we do here today, it is always an intermediary good. It is never something that you consume directly. Yeah. Market making, corporations that run markets like the New York Stock Exchange, like NASDAQ, stock exchanges in Europe, farmers markets, market towns, for example. Those markets are always run by individuals, by institutions, by local authorities. And those market makers, those are involved directly with this. Yeah. Governmental services, very closely related to bureaucratic activities. All of that is productive activities that are related to indirect intermediary goods, indirect use value, indirect creation of use value. Are there any questions?
Would you be able to explain just the educational services in that list?
Okay, educational services is a bit more difficult because you can have use value from educational services. So as an example, the class today, what is that? Well, it leads indirectly to something. It leads even in the module that we are currently participating in, it leads indirectly to your mark for the module. And this mark leads then to your, that is part of your overall mark and your overall classification for your degree. And so it leads indirectly to your degree, and your degree is an intermediary good, an intermediary input for the production of your participation in society, your participation in the production processes in our economy. Yeah, that is what I mean with it contributes to your to the intermediary goods that ultimately will deliver use value. Namely, you're trained to participate in the social division of labor in the economy, and that ultimately leads to more use value for everybody. Yeah? However, there's also an element of education that gives you direct use value. Namely, today's lecture might enlighten you, might make you more happy because you understand something better or something like that. So I'm now optimist and assume that you take something away, that it goes beyond just getting a mark and getting a piece of paper at the end of the day. Namely, you understand something better. You can talk about certain things in a different way. And so this is much closer to use value, even though understanding things better have to be expressed. You will use it later in a conversation when you get together with some other people. You might use it in writing an essay or in a report. So again, it is still an intermediary good that I deliver to you. But there are two ways that it can work out. It can work out in one way, leading to you as a full productive member of the social division of labor in our economy. And the other way that it leads to is enhancing your abilities directly and making you simply a more productive person in that regard. Is it clear?
Yeah, that's clear, thanks.
Okay, it's all fuzzy. I apologize. Everything is fuzzy today. Nothing is crisp and extremely precise. They're all, everything that we have in our society, all these aspects are there, and it's very hard to talk about things. I think I've talked long enough for the moment. Let's have a short break of a few minutes. Let's say a 3-minute break, just to catch my breath. And then we get together again at, let's say 52 minutes after the hour, or so 8 minutes before 3, something like that. Is that okay? All right. Let's resume. Let's talk a little bit more about the bearers of economic activities. I already talked about them, but there are two bearers really of economic activities. And those are the economic agents that we talked about already, and the economic goods. Yeah. So a service is not necessarily a form of economic good. A service is an activity. An economic good can be a bearer, and it can be a bearer of a service. And economic agents are bearers of those activities, and in the sense of productive and consumptive abilities or values. Yeah. Economic goods, they come in two forms, like we already discussed, namely intermediary goods. Those are really bearing productive properties, right? They lead indirectly to that use value. Down the road, there will be use value. Iron ore is a typical intermediary good. Yeah? And iron ore has great productive properties. You can make iron from it. And iron is yet another intermediary good. So one intermediary good can be part of a chain of transition from one intermediary good in another, ultimately leading to something that directly bears consumptive properties or use value, and we call them consumables, or consumption goods is another way to express that. In standard economics, neoclassical economics, it is always assumed that somehow all goods are consumption goods, that they directly contribute to use value and that they have consumption properties. Yeah. Economic agents are bearers also. They take all relevant decisions in the context of the socioeconomic space. They are the building blocks of these interactions, these activities that we talked about. And then they handle, for example, those economic goods, right? It is economic agents taking the iron ore and creating iron from them by smelting it, so to say, in high heat. And this is takes tremendous knowledge, essentially, that has been built over the millennia before the Iron Age, so to say. Economic agents have objectives. They have these preferences. They have these abilities with regard to production. All these things are tying in with objectives, what they want to do. They have means, social, networking abilities, productive abilities. So abilities is another word for means here. And they give shape to use values. It is the economic agents and how they think about things that determine the use values in our society. Those are the preferences. And they determine the social preferences also, not necessarily only the individual preferences. Yeah. It is them that made the smartphone successful, right? Apple products are a great example. Two examples. In the 80s, Apple created something called the Newton. And the Newton was a precursor, essentially, of the iPad, way ahead of its time in some sense. And it was a huge failure. It did not sell at all. Why? Because people were not ready for it. They thought it was useless, piece of junk, essentially. Nobody wanted that. It was very expensive also. However, we go 20 years down the line, and suddenly we have there the iPad. The iPad functioned in pretty much the same way. It functioned better because it was a part of a sequence of products. It was part of the sequence iMac, iPod, iPhone. It was the next iteration of those products. And it came together with a training of economic agents as consumers to appreciate this. It came together with using apps and the fact that there was an app store and that the app store was successful already because other products had introduced that. And those products were much more gentle than immediately the iPad, so to say. Yeah. So first we needed that iMac before we were able to go to other products. You know, there's a sequence, a natural sequence to that. And that Steve Jobs happened to stumble upon the correct sequence is purely accidental, by the way. So the abilities of us as economic agents to generate use values and to see the usefulness of certain goods is history dependent. It is based on us together doing things and us together getting used to things, right? Things might not work the first time, but it might well work the second time because we are ready for it. Yeah. And I think the Newton is a great example of that. All right. So besides that, besides bearing the use values and bearing the productive abilities, we are also bearing those institutions that we use. We are the ones that keep these institutions alive. And some institutions will not be accepted by us. For example, in the United States, they tried again and again and again over the past decades to introduce a coin for $1. Now, we all know that in the 19th century, the coin was incarnated, the dollar was incarnated as a coin. There was a $1 coin. And that went out of use in the 20th century when they introduced the $1 bill. And the $1 bill completely replaced all the $1 coins. Yeah. And again, the American government tried to condition people or recondition people to please accept again a coin, because coins are much less expensive to produce, have a much longer lifespan, and are much more useful in that regard. However, they refused. The American people refused to use coins. They never succeed. even very recent attempts to do that failed miserably. It's a great example of that we are bearers of institutions, and it is our acceptance of the institutions, whether institutions are successful or not. It's important to realize that. Economic activities then, they are always relational. I want to emphasize that. I have very much a network approach to what economic activity is. And so services are therefore also networked, incarnated as networks, essentially. Yeah. One very particular activity is market activity. Markets are always relational for me, right? They are never just demand and supply. They are networks, right? And they are either networked networks that are created by deliberate networking, which is the example of an organized market, because an organized market is essentially that you put people together in a space, a physical space or a virtual space, where they can interact and where they can build trade relations. So for example, your typical market on the market square in a market town, well, that is a networked market. It is a market that is built through networking with each other. Yeah. But you can also think of a market directly as a network, not necessarily as a networked infrastructure, but as a real trade network infrastructure, yeah? A networked infrastructure, a supply chain network, for example. So those are the two incarnations of markets, for me, at least. This is very different from neoclassical economics, because in neoclassical economics, of course, markets are force fields, demand and supply forces interacting with each other. Yeah. Institutions are always collective in nature. Institutions are historical. They have to come about, and they are not necessarily efficient or good. They can have very dysfunctional organizational forms that become institutional, unfortunately, right? So we have very great examples throughout history of very bad organizational forms and institutions that fail miserably again and again and again, and are simply not replaced with something that works decently, even though there would be, for example, all kinds of examples out there of organizational forms that are functional. Great examples are currently political institutions in the United States and the UK. Things are not working very well anymore, even though in the past they did. The United States is on a very long trajectory of decline and on the path to essentially political institutional failure. And that is because those institutions, like the filibuster, the rule that 60% of the senators have to approve something before laws can be passed, all these things undermine the functionality of the republic, so to say. And as a consequence, things are very dire at the moment and not good at all. Yeah. Same holds for presidential elections. We saw the Electoral College at work again this past couple of months. It's of course a purely absurd situation to organize your election in that way and to call yourself a democracy. But okay, that is just me. All right. What are those institutions then? What can we categorize these institutions that govern the socioeconomic space? And that will be, for the coming minutes, what I will do. The first category of institutions is that of media. Media are the most basic institutions. They are language and culture, right? Language is quintessential human and extremely important for the functioning of our economy. Facial expressions are very important. Smiling is very important. Body language. Culture is very important. How to dress, how to interact, what expressions to use, symbols, smileys, communication infrastructures. All that stuff is there. We live in a world where smartphones are very important. Smartphones with apps that give us these virtual tools to interact with each other. Those are part of media. Social conventions. Oh, sorry, I went too fast. Social conventions, contracting rituals, shaking hands, bowing, all that stuff. Religious rituals are very important to build community. Ceremonies, very important. Price systems, how are we communicating with each other? The terms of trade, so to say. You can have a posted pricing system, with labels. You can also have a non-posted and bargained system. Right? In many markets, you bargain over the price. And if you don't bargain, you're not really accepted as a proper person to participate in the market, right? Legal systems, laws that are written down, laws that are not written down, oral laws, so to say, or conventions, like the UK Constitution, for example, versus the United States Constitution, where everything is written down. It's still equally fuzzy, the US Constitution, by the way. And formal legal systems, judicial systems of courts and enforcement of laws, the monopoly of violence. The nation state has a monopoly on violence. They can be violent to you, but you are not allowed to be violent against anybody, essentially, because that would violate those laws, and they would then impose their violence on you. And this is literally so understood in the judicial system. Yeah. Government is also a set of institutions, essentially. It's an embodiment of leadership in the socioeconomic space. This leadership is implemented through socioeconomic organizations and systems of rules and laws and regulations. It's bureaucracy that is embodied in government, essentially. And this has been with us as human beings from the very, very dawn of humanity, right? So over time, these hominin tribes of Homo erectus first, and then all the other species of hominins that followed them, and then ultimately leading to Homo sapiens, we're slowly building this up. There has always been leadership, because leadership belongs to our networking abilities. As soon as we start to network, there is a desire for some form of leadership, some form of guidance of how we network, or what shape the network should take. Very important. All right. Then a modern ingredient to this, and this is platform architecture. In our contemporary global economy, platform architectures are very, very important. Platforms are providing the leadership in these networks, essentially. They give guidance and they impose their rules and regulations on these networks. right? And they act as market makers, or they act as leadership organizations. They set conventions, for example. Yeah? So Tesco, Amazon, those are market makers, essentially. Those are platforms, and they rule their complete supply chain. And they set the rules for the supply chain. They set the pricing rules. They set what interactions are allowed and what are not allowed, and how those are guided. Yeah, how those networks are guided, and what behavior is tolerated, and what language you use even. Monetary systems, very, very important for any human wealth creation. Money has an extremely long history. From the very first agricultural societies, a certain form of money as debt has always existed. First, it was debt registration systems in ancient empires like Sumer and Mesopotamia. They had temple economies, as they were also called. At religious centers, debts were registered. Debts to the imperial leadership, right? So the temples acted as debt registration systems, banks in some sense, primitive banks, for registering economic activity and the debts that were due to the leadership. Taxation, essentially. Yeah. Money really became something by itself after coins were invented. That happened much later in Lydia. And since then, money has been really evolving as a commodity in some sense. Yeah. And then a banking system took over again in the 19th and 20th centuries as debt registration systems, also as money holding registration systems with bank accounts and all that. And today, what do we have? We have essentially e-money, money that is completely based on registering our holdings at banks. And what are those holdings? They're still debts owed to us by the whole social division of labor to us. So when I work and I get my salary, it is essentially that they issue IOUs to me. And I can use those IOUs, those debt holdings essentially, to purchase things in the social division of labor, in the socioeconomic space in which we operate. So it has become a very complex system, of course, the monetary system. There's many layers to it. What I just talked about is just the money layer, so to say. But the financial system itself is a humongous thing at the moment. And it started all very simply from debt registration in the ancient agricultural empires. Socioeconomic roles are very important in our social division of labor. Those are institutions as well. They're packages of other institutions in some sense, and rituals and heuristics. Based on trust, very much on trust. You need to show the proper understanding of these institutions to be accepted in a certain socioeconomic role. Right? If you cannot just declare yourself to be a baker, you still need a good product. You still need to know how to do that, and you need to obey certain rules. You need to be able to display, for example, your product. It is not like you get an order and then you make it. No, you make it up front, you display the product and then sell it. And the display has to be of a certain quality even in order to be taken seriously. Yeah. All these things are very important and they all fit together, and they are based on institutions and heuristics, as we call that as well. trust of institutions is blind. I call it institutional trust. And trust extends our abilities, right? It allows us to use these institutions and to build interactions based on them. And that is that embeddedness. Trust is another word for essentially for embeddedness. So we are fully embedded in those institutions, all of these elements that I mentioned before. And that embeddedness allows us to use those things without thinking about it. I use English language without thinking much about it, even though it's second language for me. It's not my first language. And I use these expressions to communicate with you. And I build in that way a fictional reality. I try to communicate to you a story. And that story is something you might like and might be helpful for you to understand things. And that is part of that educational process that we try to do here. So it's just an example of how trust in institutions works. It is blind. You don't think about it. As soon as you start to think about it, you are becoming entrepreneurial, as I would like to call that. You suddenly see the deficiencies of it. And I start to think about the English language and how to use it. I suddenly think about how I cannot use it, or how it is impossible to use it in certain ways because I don't have the words or the right words. And I would like to change the language. And I would say, why don't we have a word for this and this and this, right? Is it not better to have that word? And we're constantly doing that, by the way. We're constantly refining our language. And we use all kinds of expressions. And we invent all kinds of new words all the time to give expression to our ideas and to help us communicate with each other. So language is a great example to talk about trust of institutions, and also talk about entrepreneurship, the entrepreneurial function with regard to the refinement of language. So we are fully embedded in these institutions. We build fictional narratives, and we created through those fictional narratives a completely fictional reality. We blindly trust money. We don't even question that if we offer these virtual IOUs to somebody, that they would not accept that, right? And if there's no acceptance, then it leads to a complete breakdown, right? You cannot have that really. Yeah. For me, trust and embeddedness are expressions of the same thing. And as such, I understand it to be a duality. Duality refers to this dual nature of one and the same thing. Yeah. Are there any questions about this? The role of institutions themselves? Okay. I come back to socioeconomic roles because socioeconomic roles are very special in some sense and so important for our understanding of the social division of labor and what this is leading to, right? First of all, socioeconomic role is a package of institutions. It is where multiple institutions come together. You use rules, you use behavioral norms, you use language, you use all kinds of tools, all kinds of institutions to build a role. And we give a name to that role usually. And then when a name is given, we socially recognize that role. And suddenly we talk about a baker, right? Instead of somebody who bakes bread, because somebody who bakes bread can also be a private person who just once in a while would bake a loaf of bread in the oven. And when we use the word baker, we mean something more serious. So it's a package of things, and we understand what that meaning is. However, the same economic agent can assume in different situations different socioeconomic roles. Today, I'm professor of economics teaching a lecture. Tonight, I will be home cooking a meal. And that act of home cooking, I suddenly become a cook in some sense, right? But not a professional cook, an amateur cook, so to say. Same holds. I might be changing the light bulbs in a lamp. Well, then I suddenly become an electrician, right? However, I'm not really an electrician. I'm just a guy changing a light bulb, right? Same holds for carpentry, for political activism, for being a student. I might be attending a seminar from another person, and it might be a seminar not in economics, but in physics or in archaeology, and suddenly I become a student. We play roles in different situations. We assume different roles, and we exchange them, interchange them quite a bit. And this is very, very good for the social division of labor, right? That we go in and out of these economic roles, because economic roles are used in a specific situation for a specific economic activity. And different roles are required if we want to conduct different economic activities. Yeah? Tonight, the economic activity is eating a meal. When I listen to a lecture on archaeology, it is attending essentially a gathering for use value. It is not necessarily for me being a student of archaeology and then getting a degree because I want to change jobs or something like that. Yeah. So, but nevertheless, I might be even paying for that lecture, and as a consequence, I'm participating in that economic activity. Yeah. Are there any questions about this? It's an important point, right? So socioeconomic roles are not singular. One economic agent is not necessarily wedded to one socioeconomic role. Only in a certain situation, a certain instance, that is the case. Now, if you go to a mathematical model, then things become very strict. Suddenly the fuzziness goes away. I need to define a certain socioeconomic role. I need to give it a mathematical form to describe production, and I need to assign a certain socioeconomic role on the consumption side and give it a mathematical expression, right? So we reduce all of this to two simple, or I should even say simplifications. I use two simplifications to describe this extremely complex thing. Yeah. And so mathematics is a great tool because you can be very precise and give crisp answers. And I can compute a price, and I can compute an output, and I can compute even the output of a certain economic agent in a certain role. But I lose the fuzziness, and the fuzziness is the thing that I talk about here today. Yeah. Anyway, all of these socioeconomic roles define our embeddedness in that socioeconomic space. Yeah. And as again, I emphasized, the socioeconomic role is composed of more primitive institutions. It's a primitive institution like language, primitive institution like a product, economic good, that everybody knows, like bread. For a baker, it is bread. It is also a shop that has to be designed in a certain way to express that it is a bakery. All in all, socioeconomic role is a complex fictional narrative composed of other fictional elements in some sense. It's a story. And by assuming socioeconomic roles, we participate in that wealth creation. We participate in that social division of labor. And I assume the role of a customer in a certain situation. And I assume the role of a producer with a certain profession in another situation. And that allows us to be, over time, to create tremendous wealth, because I first need to create an income through my productive abilities in order to spend that income on my consumption, and then only the use value is generated. Yeah. So the social division of labor is a complex thing that is completely based on the socioeconomic roles and the agents that bear them. And every individual economic agent bears multiple roles and interacts with everybody else through those socioeconomic roles. Yeah. Today you're a student, I'm the professor, and you're interacting with me as student to the professor and me as professor to the student. And tomorrow we might be meeting somewhere else and we might be in totally different roles, right? You might be working online to provide the service, and I might be contacting you with a question about that service. So those roles are interchangeable, and we do that very quickly, and that is all very human. Let's go back to the economic activity then. Economic activity is nothing but an outcome of networking and role building in the socioeconomic space. And it is all based on those institutions. It is a result of that embeddedness. Yeah. And so I go back to the very beginning. When I made a diagram, I put the infrastructure in between as the mid layer in that sandwich. Well, that is because we as economic agents use those institutions to interact with each other. We accept those socioeconomic roles. We build on those socioeconomic roles that we assume. And that is how we build economic activity. So that allows us to be a little bit more precise with regard to the socioeconomic space. I will amend then the diagram in some sense. Yeah. So the fact that we are interacting through multiple socioeconomic roles is a very important thing, and that through those socioeconomic roles we are building activities that is very important. Yeah, and we can capture that in an amended representation. Yeah. So let's go back to the diagram. We had the economic agents, we had governance system of those institutions, and then we had in between those infrastructures. But now we can amend that a little bit, and we can say, well, that centers on these socioeconomic roles. That is where really economic agents get together with the institutions. They build those socioeconomic roles. And as a consequence, we get networks. We are networking through the socioeconomic roles. Yeah? And we create organizations. We create collective organizations, and those organizations usually involve explicit leadership, and I would like to call them hierarchies. So networks and hierarchies are the natural expressions of us interacting with each other through socioeconomic roles. And for different activities and for different socioeconomic roles, those will lead to networks because they are based on equality of the socioeconomic roles. When I go as a customer into a shop and buy a loaf of bread, I'm an equal to the baker. And I have an exchange that is on an equal par. I exchange voluntarily my virtual IOUs called British pounds for a loaf of bread, and he or she, the baker, accepts that, and I will hand over the loaf of bread and I will walk out of the store. That is a networking activity that leads to a trade network. However, I can also go to my work virtually these days and I submit myself to the university hierarchy and I assume my role as a professor and I submit myself to the rules that are imposed by the university on my behavior, on my abilities to do certain things. And we are interacting here in this classroom, me as a representative of this university, conducting this class in a certain way, using conventions, using guidelines. And those are very specific to the university possibly. And that is a hierarchy. Yeah? Is it clear what I wanted to say here with regard to the various elements that make up this trade infrastructure? Right? I conclude with a restatement of the embeddedness hypothesis. All of this stuff is completely embedded in the governing institutions. And these socioeconomic roles are part of that. It is an expression of this embeddedness. And we blindly trust, that is the key word here, blind trust. We blindly trust these institutions and the socioeconomic roles and all of that hangs together with that. Yeah. Without that trust, there would not be a social division of labor and there would not be trade networks. Yeah. And no hierarchies. All right, this concludes this lecture. The next lecture I will talk about the entrepreneurial function, the other side of the socioeconomic space, so to say, that desire to change things, right? Let's have a 10-minute break. Let's return a quarter to 4. And I noticed I'm using a lot of time, so I hope to speed it up a little bit, but as you can see, there's a lot to say and a lot to communicate. It's quite complex and fuzzy and difficult. Anyway, I will see you a quarter to 4.